Welcome back to the deep dive. So, you've sent us some really interesting stuff lately, articles and official statements, all about President Trump's recent moves on tariffs.
Yeah, quite a collection. We've got PBS NewsHour, BBC, but also White House statements, notes from the Heritage Foundation, a real mix.
Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we thought, let's just try and get to grips with it all. What are tariffs, in simple terms, what's actually been done?
And what are the arguments for them? What are the supposed benefits?
Right. And then what are the big criticisms we're hearing? Basically, give you a clear picture of what's going on and, well, why it matters.
Sounds like a plan. The sources give us a good range, from the news reports laying out the sequence of events to the official lines and think tank commentary offering different takes.
Okay, cool. So let's start right at square one. A tariff. What actually is it?
Well, simply put, it's a tax. It's a tax charged on goods when they're bought from another country and brought into yours.
Usually like a percentage.
Yeah, typically it's a percentage of the product's value.
Okay. Got an example. Sometimes that helps make it clearer.
Sure. The BBC had a couple of good ones. They said, like, a 10% tariff on something that costs $10. That adds $1, makes it $11.
Uh-huh.
Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
But they also pointed out some of the tariffs on Chinese goods, well, they've gone as high as 145%.
Wow, 145%.
Yeah. So that $10 item, suddenly it costs the importer $24.50. It just shows how big the impact can be.
That's massive. So who actually pays that extra cost up front? Is it the company bringing this stuff in? Or us?
Technically, the legal bit, the responsibility falls on the importing company. They have to pay the tax.
But
But, more often than not, they need to cover that cost, so they raise their prices.
Yeah.
And that eventually trickles down to the shops and, well, potentially to us as consumers, higher prices.
right. Okay. Now, President Trump using tariffs, this isn't totally new, is it? He's got a bit of a history here.
That's a really important point.
Mhm.
The PBS source reminded us, yeah, tariffs were a big part of his playbook in his first term, especially with China. And remember, he used the threat of tariffs to push Canada and Mexico into renegotiating NAFTA. So yeah, this recent stuff fits into a longer pattern.
And it sounds like it's quite deliberate. PBS mentioned his inauguration speech talking about taxing foreign countries to, quote, enrich our citizens.
Exactly. And even this idea of an external revenue service, though that hasn't actually happened.
Right.
And that PBS timeline, it really lays out how quickly things have moved recently. Kicked off in February, executive order, tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China,
And the reason given was?
a national emergency. Over immigration and drug trafficking. That was the official justification cited. And it caused immediate outrage and promises of payback from those countries.
And they did retaliate, didn't they? It wasn't just talk.
Oh, absolutely. PBS details how China hit back almost instantly. New duties on U.S. goods, even an anti-monopoly probe into Google.
Wow.
And specific tariffs on things like U.S. coal, LNG, crude oil, farm machinery, big cars.
Yeah.
Those took effect super quick, like February 10th.
And then it seemed to broaden out from just those 3 countries.
Yeah, it did. Then came announcements about steel and aluminum tariffs going up. And crucially, removing exemptions that were in place from the 2018 tariffs.
Okay.
After that, this talk of reciprocal tariffs started. The idea being the U.S. would match whatever import tax rates other countries put on American stuff.
Which sounds potentially chaotic.
That's what economists were warning about, according to PBS.
Yeah.
Just disrupting global business. And Trump suggested countries like India, maybe some in Europe, could be next in line.
Things really seemed to accelerate in March and April then, based on that timeline. Lots of back and forth.
Definitely. For a while, those tariffs on Canada and Mexico actually went live,
Yeah.
though there was a cap on Canadian energy.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the rate on all Chinese imports doubled.
Doubled. Wow. And the reaction.
Big reactions. Canada promised tariffs on over $100 billion of U.S. goods. China targeted U.S. farm exports. Then the new steel and aluminum tariffs kicked in everywhere, which then prompted the EU and Canada to announce their own retaliatory lists. Billions worth of U.S. stuff. Textiles, appliances, bourbon, peanut butter, jeans, you name it.
And cars got dragged in, too.
Yep. Tariffs announced on auto imports. First fully built cars, then parts later.
Okay.
And that reciprocal idea got more specific, a baseline of 10% on almost everyone, but higher rates for countries with big trade surpluses with the U.S.
Like who?
They mentioned figures for China, the EU, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, on top of existing tariffs, like the ones already on China.
But Canada and Mexico were maybe exempt?
Supposedly, yeah, under USMCA, if they met U.S. demands on immigration and drugs. So A bit of leverage there.
It all sounds incredibly fluid. Announcements, then maybe pauses, then more action, especially with China.
Very much so. The U.S.-China dynamic was intense.
How do you-
Tariffs kept going up on both sides. That PTS timeline mentions a total rate of 145% on some Chinese goods, including those fentanyl-related tariffs.
145%.
Yeah. And China, unsurprisingly, vowed to hit back hard on American goods. And it wasn't just China. The EU formally approved its retaliation for the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Though they did agree to pause for 90 days, kind of matching a U.S. pause on some of the steeper reciprocal levies to allow for talks.
Okay. Okay, so that's the what. We know what tariffs are. We've walked through the, frankly, dizzying timeline. Now, the why. Why do this? What are the arguments for these tariffs, according to the sources?
Well, the White House fact sheets lay out their case pretty clearly. They talk about boosting the U.S. competitive edge, protecting sovereignty, strengthening national and economic security. That's the headline.
So the argument is trade deficits are a problem, a national emergency even, and tariffs are the fix.
Pretty much. They argue these persistent deficits have hurt American manufacturing, made supply chains vulnerable, made the U.S. too reliant on foreign adversaries.
Okay, and they're using emergency powers to do this.
Exactly. They invoked IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That lets the president regulate commerce in a national emergency. So the stated goal is using tariffs to rebuild the economy, restore security.
Right. Reducing the deficit, fair trade, protecting workers. Those are the key words.
Those are the recurring themes, yeah. They also point to what they see as unfair differences in tariff rates, like the EU and India charging higher tariffs on American cars than the U.S. charges on theirs, and other non-tariff barriers, too.
And a big part of it is trying to get companies to make things here again, reshoring.
That's absolutely central. They explicitly say tariffs are meant to incentivize companies to bring manufacturing back, drive growth for Americans, and fix those fragile supply chains and the decline in U.S. manufacturing output.
It's not just the White House saying this, though. The Heritage Foundation piece backs this up, too.
It does. Heritage argues targeted tariffs are actually a successful diplomatic tool. They cite Canada increasing border security spending after tariff threats, as an example. They see it as asserting American strength. And they suggest tariffs can be used like sanctions, but linked to things like free speech or supporting allies, going beyond just trade policy.
And the White House documents, they mention specific studies supporting their case.
They do. They cite a 2024 study claiming Trump's first-term tariffs actually strengthened the economy and led to reshoring.
Okay.
They also mentioned a 2023 USITC report that, according to the White House, found tariffs cut imports from China, boosted U.S. production, and had only minor price effects.
Minor price effects.
They referenced the Economic Policy Institute suggesting no clear link between earlier tariffs and inflation, just temporary price blips. The Atlantic Council is cited suggesting tariffs push people to buy American.
Uh-huh.
They even include comments from former Treasury Secretary Yellen saying tariffs wouldn't cause meaningful price hikes. And finally, a 2024 analysis projecting a 10% global tariff could actually grow the economy, create jobs, and raise incomes.
Okay. So that's the case for the tariffs. A lot of points about national security, economic revival, reshoring, fairness. But inevitably, there are criticisms. What are the main worries highlighted in the sources?
Yeah, PBS and the BBC both report significant concerns. Economists quoted by PBS worry about, well, much bigger negative consequences for businesses, for the whole global economy.
And the main one seems to be prices.
Absolutely. The expectation is that those higher costs will get passed on to consumers, higher prices in the shops. And the sheer unpredictability, the back and forth, the threats, the retaliation, that creates huge uncertainty for businesses trying to plan anything.
Right. That uncertainty must be tough. And the BBC piece seemed very focused on rising prices, too.
It really did. They flat out said the world economy's been thrown into chaos, and prices are expected to rise because of this.
On what kind of goods?
Many economists expect increases on imports like clothing, coffee, alcohol, electronics. Lots of everyday stuff.
And not just imported finished goods, right? What about stuff made here?
Good point. They note that even U.S.-made products could get more expensive if they use imported parts, like car parts, which might cross borders multiple times during manufacturing. Tariffs hit those supply chains.
And there were some pretty stark predictions for car prices specifically.
Yeah, the BBC mentioned an estimate from the Anderson Economic Group. They figured car prices could jump by $4,000 to $10,000 per vehicle, depending on the model. And that was based on earlier tariffs even.
Wow. Okay. So higher prices, uncertainty, any other negative economic effects
Well,
mentioned?
the BBC pointed to the big swings in global stock markets whenever there's a tariff announcement. That reflects the investor anxiety.
Uh-huh.
They also noted the UK Prime Minister expected a clear economic hit from the 10% tariff, and Jaguar Land Rover actually paused shipments to the U.S. because of the new rules.
Paused shipments, that's significant.
It is. And economists specifically warned the UK economy could suffer because of these U.S. actions.
And it ripples outwards, right? Other countries aren't just sitting back.
No, definitely not. The BBC reported EU countries are busy trying to line up other trade deals and prepping their own retaliatory measures, just in case talks with the U.S. completely break down. It really shows how these tariffs are shaking up global trade relationships.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've looked at what tariffs actually are, basically taxes on imports. We've gone through the pretty intense timeline of President Trump's recent actions.
A lot happened very quickly.
We've heard the arguments for them boosting U.S. manufacturing security, fixing trade imbalances, that kind of thing.
Right, based on the White House and Heritage Foundation perspectives and those studies they cited.
And then we've looked at the main criticisms. The big worry about price increases for regular people, the uncertainty for businesses, and the potential damage to the global economy and trade partnerships.
Exactly. I think this deep dive, based on the sources you shared, gives a pretty good overview of the different facets of this whole situation, the goals versus the potential costs.
So a final thought maybe for you, the listener. As you go about your week, maybe think about this. How might these tariffs actually touch your life? The cost of things you buy regularly.
Yeah, or even the companies you work for or invest in. Think about those global supply chains, how interconnected everything is.
What wider economic shifts, or even geopolitical ones, could these trade policies lead to down the road? Definitely something complex with lots of layers to keep exploring.